It's great to be back. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about getting focus right on Apple platforms. Jumping right in, no agenda whatsoever. But yeah, so let's understand the basics of what focus means. So the reason that this technology exists is absence of pointers, right? So we don't have any pointers on platforms like Apple TV, Vision Pro. We also use pointer-free input methods, like using your keyboard for navigation, living the keyboard navigation lifestyle, as we like to call it, on iPads or TVs, or even using your game controllers to control like apps on your TV and stuff. Those are also considered as pointer-free input methods. When you use a pointer, the system uses the coordinates of that particular pointer to communicate, to kind of understand what is the target of your interaction, or if you're writing something on your keyboard, focus is the one that tells the system, well, this is the component that this particular input is for. So yeah, focus plays a very important role in almost all of the Apple platforms. And when an element is focused, it is always displayed with some kind of special emphasis. That communicates to user, again, what kind of element they are interacting with. For example, on Apple TV, an element that is focused, a button or whatever it is always displayed with like a hover kind of effect. It kind of lifts that view on top of like the plane from other elements, and that's how you can tell that it is focused. Hopefully you can tell that the red car right there is focused. And watchOS draws a green border around controls that are focused, and this kind of indicates that this is the component that's going to receive inputs from your digital crown. So for example, I'm changing the value here. Is it changing? Yes, it is. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so when I change the values, it kind of gets the input from the digital crown. And on iPads and macOS, focused views get kind of a faint accent color border, or they also sometimes get like a faint background. Yeah, you can see like this light blue thing that changes. Yeah, there's a contrast issue, but yeah. So it could be a border or even a faint background. To sort of emphasize focus. On iPhones, of course, we've seen this before. When a text field gets focused, keyboard shows up. It could be also a picker. So getting focus on iPhones also has like a similar kind of effect, but it varies based on your user interface, of course. So yeah, to summarize, focus acts as a cursor to let user know where their input is going, or in very complex layouts, it can act as a visual reference point to make user understand which part of the app they are kind of interacting with. Yeah, so which elements are focusable? In general, if you think about an element and if it is interactive, it should be focusable. So things like buttons, text fields, segment controls, search bars. This is a non-exhaustive list, of course. I'm sure there are many. I tried to scour the internet, but nobody talks about this apparently, so yeah. And on UIKit, I also found that UI table view cell and UI collection view cells are focusable by default. So yeah, if you use UIKit, you don't have to do anything to make them focusable. And using the APIs that we're going to look at today, you can actually make anything focusable. How does that work? So looking at this view, beautiful. Image and text in a vertical stack. When I add this particular identifier, modifier, this view becomes focusable. I can use the exact same modifier with a false parameter to disable focus on a view. So for some reason, I don't want this text field to receive focus. I can use this API, disable focus. I can pass in a condition and conditionally make it focusable, whatever I want. Looking at the official documentation here, I mean, no need to read it, but interesting fact is, it is very new on iOS and iPadOS, 17 plus only, and macOS 12, tvOS 15. So still okay to use on tvOS, I guess. 15 is okay. But yeah, it's pretty new on iOS and iPadOS, so I'm guessing there's going to be some time before people actually start using it on those platforms. Right, so going back to the VStack that we saw before, what happened? Okay, I made it focusable, what's gonna happen? Nothing. That's because there is no effect. As we saw, there needs to be an emphasis on a view. It needs to do something if it receives focus. Let's say it was on Apple TV. I use my remote, swipe up to the element. Yeah, it has received focus. You don't know about it because you haven't really done anything to change its appearance when focus changed. So you need to add an effect. But what about the effect I saw before? Something like this. Well, buttons, text fields, and all the default components get it for free. So this is free and out of box for elements which by default receive focus, but it is not free for something like a custom element you've added focus for, like you are gonna have to add an effect. If you don't, your users are gonna be really confused what's happening. So yeah, recommend it. And what if your designer asks you to make it blue instead of white? Like, oh, if this receives focus, it needs to be blue for whatever reason. You're gonna have to disable the effect, unfortunately, and add it yourself. How to do that? We need to know a few more APIs to do that, so stick with me, we'll come back to this. So to understand focus, I think we should look at a sample application and gives us a really good point of view. So this is an app I created for my 2-year-old son. These days, Neil is really obsessed with vehicles, as any other 2-year-old you might see. So I thought naturally, I should create an app for this. The highs and lows of being an iOS developer. But instead of creating a iPhone app, I decided to create a tvOS app just to take advantage of the huge screen that we have. It being a touch-free interface really helps. So you don't have to, interact it with close to your face. So yeah, let's look at how this app works. So right now it's a very simple app, grid of vehicles divided into different categories, presents an opportunity to learn about categories. And as you focus on different vehicles, you can see, you can browse around. It has got exactly one feature. If you tap on a vehicle, it's going to be added to your track there. So when you select some, like a cell button, so these are buttons. So when you select a button, it's going to add that particular vehicle to the track that's there. At this point, I want to make a very important distinction between focus and selection. So when I focus on something, it just gets highlighted. But when I click on it using my remote, it gets added to the track. And it is very important to make that distinction while defining user interface of your app. And usually they mean different things. Sometimes they can mean similar things. For example, a segment control, imagine like an on and off switch. Usually when they receive focus, they also get selected. So yeah, it is slightly confusing, but usually they mean different things. So yeah, let's keep that in mind as we go. Right, going back to focus, we want to understand this particular gesture in depth. When I swipe horizontally on the remote, focus moves exactly in horizontal way. Doesn't go to diagonal vehicles. Similarly, if I swipe vertically, focus is going to go to the exact vehicle below it. Very simple, but important to understand how exactly focus works. There are only 4 directions it can travel it to. Nothing you can do to make it diagonal, believe me. So yeah, very important to understand that concept. So when you run into issues, that's how you think about those kind of problems. And at this point, we're thinking, well, my app works pretty well. And that is true. I haven't used any special focus APIs to make this work. They are buttons, as mentioned. So the effect is also out of box. And it is very important to understand this, in my opinion, that focus by default on iOS, you use SwiftUI, UIKit, doesn't matter, it's out of box. Most of the effects are free. And you can really easily get started on this platform. So that's a really cool thing. I love that. But as we add more features, we are, of course, going to run into problems. Exciting. Right. First issue. When I swipe up from this sports car, the orange one, focus is going to move to reset button as expected, right? But when I do the same thing from those first 3 vehicles or in the first row, it doesn't move up. And we're wondering, well, I expected it to go to reset button. What happened there? The reason is focus only works in adjacency basis. Remember we saw before. So when I swipe up, it is going to look for an element of a similar size, if not the exact same size. And if you don't find any, if it doesn't find anything, it's going to be like, oh, your gesture has failed, there's nothing there, and it stops. And then you're kind of confused why it stopped working. But when you do that from that vehicle, well, that works perfectly. We skipped a slide, did we? Yeah. Okay, so, right. So how do we fix this? I'm going to explain the solution visually before we look at the code. So right now, our focus target is that button on the top left, green, with a green border. What I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the focus target horizontally and make it like as wide as the screen width. What this will do is when I swipe up from this vehicle this time, it is going to get caught by something called a focus section. And this focus section will transfer the focus to focusable elements in the focus section. So yeah, that was the visual solution. How do you fix it? Well, this is my header view. Let's go over some basic structure. This is a horizontal stack of the title and the start and reset buttons. Looking at the key part of the code, I have added the focus section modifier to the horizontal stack, and that's it. So what this does is it declares the entire header view as a focus section. And this modifier can be used on any parent view, so it doesn't have to be direct parent. Just make sure it is bigger than the target, otherwise it's not going to work, of course. And what else? Yeah. Let's look at the demo. Oh, works perfectly. Amazing. Again, official documentation does what it says. Interesting bit, it's not supported on iOS and iPadOS, only tvOS and macOS. And I'm guessing here that the reason may be because it makes more sense on big screens. That's probably why it's not supported on iOS and iPadOS. But yeah, we don't know for sure. Next problem, more interesting one. So this one, I'm coming up with some, I'm brainstorming features to improve the engagement of this app, right? And one of the features that I came up with is the track preview feature. So what if I'm, when I browse around vehicles, I want to see a preview of how the vehicle looks like on the track before you add it. And I think it will be fun. It kind of like shows people, shows the users like, oh, this vehicle is this, and it kind of lets them browse around, encourages them to look at different vehicles. So I think it's going to be fun and engaging. But looking at this particular feature, I realized that, I need to know exactly which vehicle is focused now. Until now, we didn't know that. So that poses one problem. Another problem that I foresee from here is my focused vehicle would be part of this grid view, but I need to now somehow render it on the track view, which actually doesn't have any knowledge of it. So there is like some kind of a data flow issue there. Right, one problem at a time. To expose focus state, there are so many APIs. But let's not get overwhelmed. We're going to look at the most basic, simplest API, the focus state API. In simpler words, let's not read that. It can be used to access changes in focused elements on your screen. So that's what we're going to use it for. Jumping into the code, this is my this is my vehicle view. Vehicle view, as we saw before, it's a vertical stack of an image and a text, and it is embedded inside a button, as I mentioned before. And I'm going to use this particular focus state property wrapper. It's a dynamic property, of course. Is focused is the name, it's of type Boolean. And I'm going to bind this property to the entire button using .focused modifier. And as you may have guessed, this property starts working as soon as we add it. It's going to be false because it is not in focus, and once it receives focus, it's going to be set to true. Easy as that. Right, so now we know if a button is in focus, and the button itself knows when it is in focus. We can we can use this API to actually add a custom focus effect, something like this. So let's say I wanted to change the focus state to a blue color instead of white. What I could do is just switch the background color based on the focus state. So it's like a simple ternary operator. I've also added a scale based on the focus. So works perfectly, nothing wrong with that. But this is kind of limited, right? Like if I wanted to add an animation when an element receives focus, like what would I do? You can use this way. So we can use the onChange modifier, which basically calls, you can add to any dynamic property, and what it will do is it will call that closure every time the property changes. So if you add it on isFocus property, it's going to get called every time, and then you can add an animation, update your view models, do whatever you want. So pretty flexible. I also personally feel this keeps your changes more concise than the previous approach. But the previous approach also works pretty well if you have like not many properties to change based on focus. So yeah, we got that out of the way. We now know how you can apply custom focus effects. But let's go back to the problem we have. Just knowing if the button is focused is not enough. After all, we have this entire grid of vehicles. In this case, I only show a row, but yeah, imagine it as a grid. You need to know exactly which particular property is in focus. Luckily for us, focus state property wrapper also supports hashable types. So vehicle is hashable, by the way. Just to understand this particular thing that we're looking at here, going back, yeah. So it is a horizontal stack. I'm running a for each loop over an array of vehicles and rendering every button. So yeah, next slide, yeah. On the focused, so what I'm doing here is I have changed the name of the variable to focused vehicle, and the type is now vehicle. And I'm using the same modifier, .focused, but this time I'm gonna have to provide a value. So this is our way of telling SwiftUI, assign this value to this particular variable when this particular button is in focus. And this is in a loop, right? So this happens for every single button. So whenever a button receives focus, it is going to go and update that property and assign like a value to it. The value is pulled from the for each loop, pretty simple. We already were looping over it, so we had it handy. And yeah, as expected, it's going to be nil at start. And important to note, the type has to be an optional. It's kind of required because focus is going to move out of your view. And at some point, none of your vehicles are in focus. So it needs to be an optional because SwiftUI will set it to nil at some point. So yeah, it's going to be nil because none of the things are in focus right now. Once they receive focus, one of the vehicles gets updated. And as you update your focus, the focused vehicle value changes. And yeah, going back, now we know exactly which vehicle is in focus. Going back to the track preview feature, are we ready to implement it now? Well, unfortunately, we are not. Let me explain. So this entire screen is called play view. So my play view is divided into header view, we already saw this, track view, which is my road or track, and the entire grid. And right now what I did was I only added the focused vehicle variable to the grid view. So grid view knows which vehicle is focused. Other people don't know it yet. And those of us who worked on SwiftUI a little bit, we've seen this problem before, and we're like, oh, just take it out. Take it out of the grid, put it in the play view, and just expose it as bindings. So this is like a usual solution we throw in for all data flow issues in SwiftUI. So I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. But yeah, what's going to happen is when a new vehicle comes under focus, grid view will update it, and track view will receive its updates. So yeah, works perfectly. And I've tested this approach, and it works. But you have to sort of wonder, why is it so manual? After all, focused focused things are very close and inherent part of SwiftUI or the focus engine. Can't SwiftUI do something for us here? And yeah, there is something that they do. It's called focused value property wrapper. Let's look at it. Yeah. So this one has been there since version 14, tvOS, iOS, iPadOS, and macOS 11. This simply is meant for observing values supplied by any current focus state. And it also enables data flow. If you have created custom environment keys and objects in SwiftUI, this process is extremely similar. But if you haven't, stick with me. This is mostly just boilerplate code, but we'll go through it step by step. First step, yeah, so you're going to confirm to focused value key thing. And by confirming to it, the only thing we are going to achieve is defining the type. So what's the type of our value going to be? It's going to be of vehicle type, of course. So we did that. Next thing is we're going to provide getters and setters using the key that we defined before. And it is also going to be optional, as we know, because it's going to be set to nil when focus moves out of the grid to the reset button, for example. And yeah, so very similar to how you define keys for your custom environment objects. And focused values can be thought of as a collection of state, just like your environment object, but it is a collection of state for related to like focused things. So you can add multiple keys here. If you have like a login screen, you could have another key to indicate which text field is in a focus. So yeah, you can create multiple keys here, and you can think of focused values as a collection of those states. So yeah, once we created the key, we're gonna use it. I went back to the implementation of focus state here. So what we're going to do, we're going to make exactly 2 changes. First thing, get rid of this property. We don't need to store focused vehicles anymore. It's going to be stored in the key we created before, so SwiftUI will store it for us. And this distinction is important, right? Because now SwiftUI stores it in special memory. We don't have to use application memory for it. And next step, we are going to use a new kind of modifier, focused value. Remember, the previous modifier was called .focused, small change. This one is focused value, and it works with focused value property wrappers. Here, simple as before, you are instructing SwiftUI to assign this value to this key path when this particular button is in focus, just like before. And yeah, we've exposed our focused vehicle out into the environment. Everybody needs to know about this now. So who needs to know about it? Our track view. So just looking at the basic structure of track view again. Track view is a Z-stack because it has an overlapping road image and the cars. First thing on the horizontal stack of cars is the vehicles you've already added. And then the next thing we're going to append is the preview, not to be confused with SwiftUI previews. But yeah, sorry about that. Naming failure. Next thing I'm going to do is to add the focused value property wrapper and define my dynamic property. This is our way of telling SwiftUI, I'm going to observe this property, refresh me whenever this changes. So yeah, we did that. Now our view kind of depends on it. Next thing I did was just simply use it now. I've unwrapped it using iflet, and then I just render my track vehicle view with some kind of like opacity and borders. But important thing to note here is that this approach now ensures that if this value is nil, this view will be hidden, and that is why that is exactly why we used iflet, right? So it won't be rendered; it would be hidden when that particular variable is nil. And my favorite part, looking at your app working flawlessly is an amazing experience. Yeah, so whenever I change it kind of updates my track view, works perfectly well. Amazing. And I definitely think this is more engaging than our previous version. Now, something I didn't mention before, focused value by definition only works for value types. So what I mean by this is when your focused views supply a property, it needs to be a value type. And luckily, I created a struct, so vehicle was a value type, so it worked out perfectly. But what if you're providing observable objects? You have another property wrapper. Thanks, SwiftUI. So yeah, one change though, this came 2 versions late. So this only came in version 16, iOS, iPadOS, and tvOS, and macOS 13. The other one we saw before, if you remember, came in version 14. So yeah, it could happen that you can't use this guy, but if you can't, you can always fall back to using focus state that we saw before. It does work for reference types and value types both. So yeah, you can always go back to using focus state. It's really useful, actually. Like the most useful identifier property wrapper is focus state, in my opinion, if you're dealing with focus. All right, last issue. So when I launched my app, I noticed that focus always went to the reset button at first. Well, the reason for this is when you launch any app, your focus engine is going to create a focus chain. And this focus chain, depending on your locale, left to right or right to left, it starts from either directions. And in our case, we're using English, which is left to right. So it started from the top left corner, and it will basically just use the first element in the chain and assign focus to that element. And yeah, it happened to be reset button, unfortunately, so yeah. But in my opinion, user experience would be so much better if focus is on the first element of the grid. So yeah, it would have been nice if that would have been the first element, but it's not. But we can change that. I also feel reset button doesn't do anything at the start, so it doesn't make any sense. Also, looking at the average age of our target users, they might never want to use that button. So yeah, how do we change that? So we're going to use prefers default focus modifier for this. To do that, it's a 3-step process. Sorry, I forgot to show you my play view. So play view, as we saw before, is a vertical stack. It has a header, track view, and the vehicle grid. Right now, focus goes to header. We want to change that and make vehicle grid your preferred default focus guy. So I'm going to define a namespace and bind that. So namespaces play a very important role with focus manipulations on big screens. That's because your app can have like multiple scenes, as they like to call it. So in this case, for example, my entire play view is the one I want to define default focus for, but assume you have an iPad app, they usually have sidebars and main view. So what you could do is you could define a namespace for your sidebar and say, oh, I want the 5th element to receive focus for whatever reason. And on the other main view, there could be like a different guy you want to sort of prefer focus for. So yeah, you have to define a namespace. I am just going to define a main namespace and assign it to the entire vStack, which is my play view. And oh, forgot about the arrows. Yeah, and the third step we're gonna do is to assign, to use the namespace and say, in this entire namespace, this is the guy that I want to be the default focus guy. And that's what happens. Let's launch it. All right. So when I launch my app, grid view is the one that gets focus. And luckily, we want it to be on the first element, which is by default. So first element is the one that got focus in the grid view. If for random reason, I wanted it to be the third car, the green thing there, I could have done that too. I would have just defined another namespace inside the grid view, and again use the same modifier. You can pass in like a condition as well and say, if index equal to 2, then this needs to take default focus, and yeah, you could do whatever you want with that. And yeah, looking at the entire documentation again, does what it says, takes a namespace and also a Boolean value, so you can pass in a condition there if you want to conditionally change default focuses. One thing to note here is if you have multiple views competing for default focus, SwiftUI will fall back to the focus chain. Like if you have a bug in your code and multiple elements are saying, oh, I want default focus, like it will not work. So if it doesn't work, probably have a bug in your code. Right, next thing, oh yeah, and this is also not supported on iOS and iPadOS, which is kind of unfortunate because this property is quite useful, I think, on iOS and iPad, but there is a similar modifier, it's called default focus instead of prefers default focus. It works slightly differently. It uses focus states. You could check out the documentation. Because of lack of time, I didn't really add that today. But yeah, it's very useful if you have forms in your app, and then you want different elements, different text boxes to take focus based on different conditions. If you're validating your form, maybe you want the focus to be on the element which has an error, validation error. You could do like a lot of things. But yeah, this one actually is useful on small screens. Right. So I have talked a lot about focus, but I've only talked about focus from the perspective of tvOS. And there are multiple reasons for this. One of the reasons is I really feel that this platform is slightly underappreciated and deserves more love. We don't really build many apps for this platform, even if most of us are actually already capable of doing it. Like, we have the entire skill set. Focus is kind of your missing tool in your toolbox, and once you have that, you can actually build apps for tvOS, no problem. And they tend to be less complicated, in my opinion. And another reason is focus. The concept of focus is very easy to understand from the perspective of a TV. All of us have used a smart TV at some point, so we know about this concept already. And another reason, but focus is actually gaining a lot of traction on iPad with hardware keyboard and macOS with hardware keyboard. Focus also, the same concepts apply on visionOS as well. So another reason is gaining a lot of traction. And watchOS, Digital Crown, same thing. There is not a lot of screen on your watches. So actually focus plays a pretty important role. And of course, iPhones with software keyboards, we already saw this. Whenever they receive any kind of input, like they are basically, they are the ones that have received focus. But I really want to talk about iPad as well. There is a very key difference between how focus works on iPad and tvOS, and then I don't want you to be confused when you do that, so I wanted to specify this. And another thing to note is focus is really new on iPads. Like, there was no concept before iPadOS 15. Yes, 15. So before version 15, there was no concept of focus, but Apple kind of introduced it in this version. And after that happened, iPad is gaining a lot of traction, like focus on iPad, sorry. And the reason for this is Apple really wants you to support keyboard navigation on iPads, because at least this guy thinks so. And we know, like, people who are living the keyboard navigation lifestyle. Like, we already know those people. Maybe we are those people. Who knows? But yeah, coming back to key difference. So when you use a remote on your TV, focus can only flow in 4 directions. But iPad has two levels of changes, two levels of how focus works. The first level is the tab key. So when you use a tab key on your iPad, as you can see, I've pressed the tab key here. Focus moves between focus groups. We don't have this on TVs, so that's why it's different. Observe how the red border changes from the sidebar to the main view. And then I can use arrow keys inside the focus group to navigate. So yeah, that's like a key difference. This particular interaction is exactly like TVs, but the earlier one, the tab key one, is interesting. And your implementation actually doesn't change, but it really changes how users behave, like users use your app. If you want to support this, you can actually even use your simulator. Just turn on a setting. It's called full keyboard access setting in your accessibility, and you can literally use your keyboard to navigate the entire iPad without using the mouse. Sorry, the touchscreen. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. The code for this app is available publicly on GitHub if you'd like to have a look. And if you are interested in the app that you saw, please let me know so I can justify the time I spent on that app. And if you have questions, I'd love to chat. I would love to chat about anything. So please catch me in the breaks or at the after party. And I look forward to making more friends this year and catching up with the old ones. Thank you.